He signed the papers without looking at her once. That was the part that broke something no one could name. Not the lawyers, not the fluorescent courthouse light humming overhead, not even the word he used, forgettable, dropped like loose change onto a conference table. It was the fact that Rowan Voss never lifted his eyes. 5 years of marriage, and he couldn't spare her a single second of his attention on the day he ended it. Elena Vale set down her pen, smoothed the front of her coat with both hands, and walked out of that room without a word. No tears, no backward glance, just the quiet click of heels on marble, steady as a metronome, fading until there was nothing left of her at all. Rowan leaned back in his chair and told his attorney to send the finalized documents by end of day. He thought that was the last of it. He was wrong in ways that would take months to fully understand, and cost him nearly everything before he did. If you've ever been made to feel invisible by someone who should have seen you clearly, drop your city in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story hits different for you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what's coming in the next 4 parts will change everything you think you know about power, love, and the price of underestimating the wrong person. Now, let's begin. The morning of the divorce, Rowan Voss woke before his alarm and lay in the dark of his penthouse bedroom, staring at the ceiling with the particular stillness of a man who had already made up his mind about something and was simply waiting for the clock to catch up. I was 41 years old, the founder and chief executive of Voss Security International, a firm with contracts on 5 continents and a client list that included 3 sitting heads of state, 2 royal families, and a network of private defense contractors that most governments pretended didn't exist. He had built it from a $70,000 seed loan at 24 and a willingness to work in places other people refused to go. He was not a man accustomed to loose ends. Elena had been a loose end for the better part of 2 years. He sat up, reached for his phone, and scanned through the overnight briefings his security team sent at 4 a.m. 3 threat assessments. 1 escalating situation in a port city he couldn't name publicly. 2 personnel updates. He read them the way he read everything. Fast, precise, already thinking 3 steps ahead. And set the phone down without checking his messages from her, because there weren't any. There hadn't been in a long time. That, more than anything, had felt like confirmation. He didn't ask himself whether he was sad. He dressed in the dark. Gray suit, no tie, the kind of clothes that communicated authority without trying. He drank his coffee standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a city that had not yet fully woken, and he watched the first pale seam of light open along the eastern skyline and thought about his afternoon meetings and whether the Meridian account would need restructuring by Q3. He did not think about Elena, or he tried not to. The truth, the version he would have denied if pressed, was that he had thought about Elena more in the last 6 months than in the entire preceding 4 years combined, and not in the way a man thinks about a woman he loves, more the way you think about a door left open in a room you keep meaning to return to. A vague, unresolved awareness, something slightly wrong that you couldn't locate precisely enough to fix. She had been easy to marry. That was how he'd always framed it to himself. Not warmly, but efficiently. They had met at a charity function 5 years ago, introduced by a mutual contact whose name he could barely recall now. Elena had been quiet in a way that wasn't shyness, dressed plainly in a room full of people competing to be noticed. She hadn't tried to impress him. She hadn't laughed too loudly at his observations or leaned in with calculated interest the way the women in his professional orbit usually did. She had simply listened, asked 2 or 3 questions that were sharper than he expected, and then excused herself early. He'd asked for her number before she reached the door. Even then, he hadn't been entirely sure why. The marriage that followed had been functional, stable. Elena managed their home with a quiet competence that required no direction from him. She was never late, never demanding, never embarrassing at events. She could hold a conversation with a diplomat or a defense contractor or a bored billionaire's wife without effort and without pretension. She disappeared for days at a time on what she described as visits to old friends from her years abroad, and he had never pressed for details because he had never particularly wanted them. They had separate schedules, separate rhythms, and what passed between them in the evenings was mostly silence and the television and the particular loneliness of 2 people occupying the same space without actually sharing it. He had told himself at various points that this was what a mature partnership looked like, that passion was for younger people with fewer responsibilities, that what Elena provided, consistency, discretion, and absence of drama, was genuinely valuable and not something to be dismissed. He'd believed it until about 8 months ago, when Damian Cross had sat across from him at dinner and slid a manila envelope across the table with an expression of rehearsed regret. Damian was his oldest professional partner. They'd built the early years of Voss Security together, handled contracts neither of them talked about at dinner parties, and had accumulated between them the kind of mutual knowledge that made the friendship essentially permanent. When Damian handed him that envelope, Rowan hadn't felt alarm. He'd felt the dull, preparatory weight of something he'd been half expecting without knowing it. The contents were financial records, offshore transfers in amounts too large to dismiss and too precisely timed to be coincidental. Account numbers that traced back, through a chain of shell entities, to names Rowan didn't recognize. Damian said the accounts were connected to Elena. He said he'd discovered them during a routine audit of the firm's financial exposure. He said he was sorry. Rowan had sat very still and looked at the documents for a long time without speaking. Then he'd folded them back into the envelope, thanked Damian with a brevity that made the other man visibly uncomfortable, and driven home. He hadn't confronted Elena that night. He hadn't confronted her at all, in the end. Instead, he had spent 6 months constructing, in the privacy of his own mind, a verdict. He reviewed the evidence Damian had provided multiple times. He commissioned a quiet independent audit through a third-party firm he trusted, or believed he trusted, and received results that aligned with what Damian had shown him. He thought about the absences. He thought about the calls she occasionally took in other rooms. He thought about the year she had traveled to 3 different countries in a single month for reasons she described as vague enough to seem deliberate. He assembled these fragments into a shape that looked, from where he was standing, like confirmation. He never asked Elena directly. He told himself it was because he didn't want to give her the opportunity to construct a lie. The truth, which he was not yet honest enough with himself to name, was that some part of him was afraid of what she might say, not because she might confirm his suspicions, but because she might dismantle them completely, and he had already committed to the decision, and changing course felt like weakness. He filed for divorce 11 days later. The lawyers handled everything with the kind of speed that money makes possible. Elena received the documentation, signed where she was asked to sign, and raised no objections. She made no demands. She did not ask for a settlement meeting or a mediation session or even a phone call. She signed and returned and waited for the date they'd set for finalization. That restraint, in retrospect, should have told him something. It didn't. The courthouse was on the west side of the financial district, 40 floors up, in a building made almost entirely of glass. The hearing itself lasted less than 20 minutes. The judge was efficient, and the lawyers were prepared, and Elena sat across the table in a pale gray coat with her hands folded and her eyes on the middle distance. And Rowan did not look at her directly once from the moment he entered the room. Not when the terms were read, not when the papers were passed, not when his attorney made a remark, intended, Rowan understood, as a private observation but spoken with the casual cruelty of a man who believed the woman across the table was not particularly interesting, that she had always struck him as the most forgettable kind of wife, someone you could share 5 years of your life with and never actually know. Rowan did not correct him. Later, much later, and in circumstances he could not have imagined standing in that room, he would understand that his silence in that moment was the thing that truly ended something between them. Not the filing, not the papers, that silence. But he didn't know that yet. He watched her sign her name, watched her set the pen down with a precision that was somehow more controlled than anything he had ever seen her do. And then she stood, and she looked at him, directly, fully, without flinching, for exactly 3 seconds. He looked away first. She walked out. He gathered his portfolio and accepted his attorney's handshake and reminded himself that loose ends were dangerous, and that clarity, even painful clarity, was always preferable to ambiguity. He took the elevator down to the lobby. The plan was to return directly to the office. He never made it. His driver had barely pulled into traffic when the call came through on the secure line. Not his personal phone, but the encrypted channel reserved for critical operational alerts. The voice on the other end was Marcus, his head of intelligence, and Marcus was speaking in the clipped, flattened tone that indicated something significant had happened, and he was processing the scope of it in real time. "Sir, there's a situation outside the east entrance of the courthouse." Defined situation. A pause. Not the kind that meant Marcus was gathering information. The kind that meant he was deciding how to structure something that didn't fit into standard categories. You should see it yourself. The car rerouted. 3 minutes later, Rowan was standing on the sidewalk 40 yards from the courthouse's service entrance, looking at something that his mind was working to categorize and failing. The vehicle was an armored limousine, not unusual in this city, but the specific model was a modified platform that civilian manufacturers did not produce. The exterior was obsidian black to a degree that seemed less like paint and more like an absence of light, and the dimensions were wrong for any standard configuration. It sat behind a loose formation of 4 additional vehicles, all black, all running, arrayed in a pattern that suggested trained personnel who did not need to be told where to position themselves. The men standing along the perimeter were dressed in tailored black suits, not the interchangeable approximation of formal wear that private security firms usually deployed, but something precise and deliberate. They were armed. Rowan could tell from posture and the lines of the jackets. And they were not trying to conceal the fact. There were 14 of them that he could see, possibly more in the vehicles. His driver had his hand near his own weapon. Marcus, who had followed in a separate car, appeared at Rowan's shoulder and said nothing, because there was nothing analytical to contribute yet. Elena came through the service entrance at 10:47 in the morning. She was still in the pale gray coat. She had not changed. She had not stopped to collect anything, as far as Rowan could observe. She had walked out of the courthouse, turned toward the service exit, and emerged here. And the moment she cleared the door, the 14 men in tailored black suits did something Rowan had never seen a private security formation do in any operational context he had encountered in 17 years of building a security firm. They knelt. Not a bow. Not a respectful tilt of the head. They went down on one knee, every one of them, in a motion so synchronized it could not have been improvised, and they held the position until Elena raised one hand slightly, a small gesture, almost dismissive, and they rose. The rear door of the limousine was already open. Someone inside the vehicle said something Rowan couldn't hear at this distance. He watched Elena pause at the threshold of the car. She turned her head once, not toward him specifically, but in the general direction of the street, as if she was aware of being observed without particularly caring. Then she looked at something just inside the vehicle and answered. He couldn't make out the words. But he saw her expression, and it was not the expression he had catalogued over 5 years of marriage. It was not the careful neutrality she deployed at his business dinners, or the patient blankness she maintained through long evenings when he worked through conversations she wasn't part of. It was something else, something settled and sure and faintly amused, as if the world had confirmed a thing she had known for a long time and found the confirmation more tedious than surprising. The aircraft was barely visible from where he stood, but Marcus had a line on it within 4 minutes through the airport's tracking system. A private Boeing, custom configuration, extended range, the kind of aircraft that costs more than the average country's annual defense budget, sitting on a runway at the private terminal 3 miles east with its engines already cycling. It took Marcus another 6 minutes to identify the tail markings. He showed Rowan the screen without speaking. The silver crest on that aircraft was not something you needed to be in this industry long to recognize. It appeared in threat briefings across 40 countries. Intelligence agencies tracked it the way they tracked state actors. There were entire departments of national security institutions dedicated to documenting its movements. In the underworld, the layer of the world that Rowan had spent his career operating adjacent to without fully entering, it was not a symbol. It was a verdict. It meant the man who commanded it was watching, and that his patience was finite, and that when his patience ended, entire structures disappeared. The crest of the Draven Empire. Cashin Draven. The limousine was already moving. The security formation had collapsed back into the vehicles with the efficiency of a military extraction. The convoy was gone before Rowan finished processing what he'd seen, pulling into a lane of traffic that somehow opened ahead of them as if the city itself understood it should clear the way. Marcus said, "Sir, I know what it is. The aircraft is registered to a holding company and, well, it's not registered to anything traceable, sir, but the crest, I said I know." He stood on the sidewalk in the cold morning air, with his coat unbuttoned and his hands at his sides, and the sound of the city washing around him. And he thought about Elena sitting across from him in the courthouse not 3 hours ago, signing documents with the calm of someone completing a routine administrative task. He thought about her hands folded on the table. He thought about the 3 seconds she had looked at him and the way he had looked away. He thought about 14 armed men in tailored suits going down on one knee. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was a number he didn't recognize, not unidentified, but physically unknown to him, a string of digits that didn't correspond to any country code he could immediately place. He answered. The voice was a man, older. The accent carried the kind of careful international neutrality that came from spending decades in rooms where revealing your origins was a tactical liability. The tone was measured and precise, the way you speak when you are accustomed to saying exactly what you mean and nothing more. Mr. Voss, the voice said, welcome home. My daughter sends her regards. The line went dead before Rowan could respond. He stood there for another full minute, phone still raised, the wind picking up off the street, people moving around him with the indifferent urgency of a city going about its morning, and the single word the voice had used echoing in the space where his certainty used to be. Daughter. Marcus was watching him. The driver was watching him. Both of them had the professional sense not to speak. Rowan lowered his phone. Get me everything, he said. Every record, every contact, every piece of documentation we have on Cassie and Draven and any associated entities. I want it on my desk in 2 hours. Sir, Marcus hesitated. Some of that material is in restricted channels. The kind of channels where pulling the file generates a notification on the other end. Rowan looked at him. Pull it anyway. He got into the car. The door closed. Outside, the courthouse building reflected the morning light in long, cold panels. And somewhere 3 miles east, a private Boeing was finishing its pre-flight sequence. And on the runway below it, dozens of men in tailored black suits were watching the boarding stairs, in the particular stillness of people who were not guards but soldiers, and who understood the difference. Rowan sat in the back of his car with his hands on his knees and his jaw set, and the first real crack beginning to open in the architecture of everything he believed he had understood. He had spent 5 years married to a woman he had decided was ordinary. He was beginning to understand, with the specific vertigo of a man whose foundations have just shifted, that he had never known her at all. And somewhere in the back of that recognition, beneath the professional alarm, beneath the strategic calculations already starting to fire in the parts of his mind trained to respond to threats, something that he had not let himself feel in a very long time was beginning, quietly and against his will, to wake up. He didn't name it yet, but it was there. The files arrived in 90 minutes, not 2 hours, because Marcus understood that when Rowan Voss used the word anyway, he meant it in the particular way that closed all further discussion. Rowan was already at his desk when the first package came through the secure server. Not the main Voss security network, but the shadow system, the one that ran parallel and offline and existed specifically for the category of information that could not be allowed to touch anything traceable. He had built it 6 years ago for exactly this kind of situation. He had never imagined using it to research his own wife. Ex-wife. He corrected himself without sentiment and opened the first file. What he found in the next 40 minutes did not clarify anything. It made everything worse in the specific way that new information makes things worse when it doesn't fit any existing frame. Not by contradicting what you believed, but by revealing that the frame itself was wrong. Cashin Draven was documented. That much existed. Interpol maintained a file that ran to several hundred pages and had been updated continuously for 31 years. The man was believed to be in his late 60s, possibly older. Origin unknown with certainty. There were 3 competing theories across 3 different intelligence services, and none of them agreed. He had surfaced in the early 90s as a mid-level operator in the Eastern European arms trade, and then, with a speed that analysts still cited as anomalous, he had become something else entirely. Not just larger, structurally different. The organizations beneath him didn't operate like crime families. They operated like institutions, with hierarchies and protocols and internal accountability mechanisms that were, by several assessments Rowan had now read, more sophisticated than those of some legitimate governments. By the early 2000s, Draven wasn't a crime lord. He was an architecture, a system, a set of interlocking relationships and implied threats that had become so deeply embedded in the infrastructure of international commerce and private security that removing him would have required dismantling significant portions of both. Intelligence services knew this. Most of them had, at various points, attempted to act on it. The attempts produced no usable results and, in 2 documented cases, significant personnel losses. After that, the general posture had shifted from pursuit to containment and documentation. The Silver Crest. Rowan stared at a photograph, grainy, taken from distance, the kind of image that suggested the photographer understood exactly how much risk was involved, of the emblem on the side of an aircraft sitting on a private runway in a country he wasn't going to write down. The crest was simple, a stylized wing bisected by a vertical line. It appeared on aircraft, on the lapels of certain men in certain rooms, on the rear doors of vehicles that moved through cities without being stopped. It appeared in one intelligence report, on the ID badges of 3 individuals who had presented themselves as private security consultants at a summit meeting attended by 4 sitting finance ministers. The crest of the Draven Empire. And then, 41 minutes into his reading, Rowan found the gap. It wasn't dramatic. It presented as a documentation anomaly, the kind that trained eyes miss because trained eyes are looking for the presence of things, not the strategic absence of them. But Rowan had spent 17 years building a firm whose core competency was identifying exactly this kind of structured void. Elena Vale did not exist before 11 years ago, not in any traceable form. No childhood records, no educational history, no tax filings, no property records, no digital footprint of any kind prior to a carefully constructed identity that materialized, fully formed, approximately 11 years before their courthouse appearance this morning. The identity was good, better than anything a private firm could produce, the kind of construction that suggested access to systems that most people didn't know existed. But it had a seam. One small seam in a cross-reference customs record from a transit hub in a country that no longer existed under the same name, where a passport number appeared twice in a 48-hour period under different names, and one of those names connected, through a chain of 4 steps that took Rowan 20 minutes to trace, to a financial holding structure that sat beneath a structure that sat beneath another structure that had, at its foundation, a single registered agent. The registered agent's address was a building in a city whose municipal records had been partially digitized in 2019. The building had been demolished in 2003. The demolition permit was signed by a city official who had retired in 2001. The signature was a forgery. Rowan sat back in his chair. His coffee had gone cold. He didn't notice. The city outside his office windows was doing its midday thing. Traffic building. The distant sound of construction somewhere to the north. The flat gray light of an overcast afternoon pressing against the glass. His PA had knocked twice, and he had said nothing both times, and she had learned long ago what that meant. The phone on his desk rang. The internal line. Marcus. "Sir, we have a development." "Come in." Marcus entered the way he always did, without ceremony, moving to the chair across the desk with a tablet in one hand and the expression of a man who had spent the morning being consistently surprised and had decided to stop reacting to individual surprises and simply report them as they arrived. "The intelligence pool generated 3 notifications," he said, "on the Draven file. 3 separate systems registered that someone accessed the material. I expected one. So did I. The other 2 are... we don't know whose they are. The system signatures don't match anything in our database. They're not government. They're not any private entity we have cataloged." He set the tablet on the desk face up. But one of them responded. Rowan looked at the screen. It was a message. No sender identification. No header. Just text, plain and direct. "You are asking the right questions. You are asking them 12 hours too late. Be careful who you trust in your own building." Rowan read it twice. "When did this come in?" 40 minutes ago. We've been trying to trace the origin since. We won't find it." "No, we won't." He turned the tablet back toward Marcus. "Who has access to the shadow server?" "Myself. You. Damien Cross. Though his credentials haven't been active in... I'd have to check the log, but at least 6 weeks." "Check the log." Marcus didn't move immediately. He was looking at Rowan with the particular careful expression of a man who was doing arithmetic and not liking the sum. "Sir, is there something specific I should be looking for?" "Check every access event on the shadow server for the last 8 months, every one. And do it from your personal terminal, not the main system. Don't log it through the firm's network." Now Marcus moved, quickly, without further questions, which told Rowan that he had already been doing his own arithmetic and had arrived in roughly the same neighborhood. The door closed. Rowan picked up his phone and scrolled to the number he had for Damien Cross and held it there for a moment without pressing call. They had known each other for 16 years. Damien had been his first real hire, not operationally but strategically, the person who handled the relationships and the introductions and the long-game maneuvering that turned a capable security firm into something governments took seriously. He was good at it in the specific way that required a particular kind of intelligence. Not analysis, but social architecture, the ability to be in a room and understand which person needed what kind of attention and apply it with precision. Rowan had always trusted that quality in him, had relied on it. He set the phone down without making the call. Instead, he opened this personnel file on his internal system and pulled Damien's access history for the last 8 months, and looked at it for 3 minutes, and then pulled the independent financial audit he had commissioned 6 months ago, the one that had confirmed Damien's initial report about Elena's accounts, and looked at that for another 5. Then he called the auditing firm directly. Not their main line, the cell number of the senior partner, a man named Gerald Fitch, who owed Rowan a favor from a situation 4 years ago that neither of them discussed. Gerald answered on the 3rd ring. "Rowan, been a while. The audit you ran for me in March, the offshore accounts." A pause. "The Vale matter, yes. I need you to tell me something, and I need you to be precise. Did the documentation you reviewed come directly from the financial institutions, or was it provided to you through an intermediary?" Another pause. Longer. "Gerald, it was provided through an intermediary. Your office indicated it was standard procedure, given the sensitivity. Which person in my office?" The pause this time was the kind that meant Gerald Fitch had just understood something and was recalibrating the conversation in real time. "The contact was a Mr. Cross," he said. "Damien Cross. He was listed as your authorized representative for the engagement." Rowan said, "Thank you, Gerald," and ended the call. He sat with that for exactly 90 seconds. Not because he needed time to process it. The implications were immediate and they were catastrophic. But because he was a man who had learned over many years and in high-pressure situations that the first 90 seconds after a significant revelation were the most dangerous. That the decisions made in that window were almost always wrong because they were made from the wrong state. He let the 90 seconds pass. Then he stood, put on his jacket, and walked out of his office. He found Damien in the 4th-floor conference room running a call with a client in another time zone, leaning back in his chair with his feet on the edge of the table and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, talking in the easy, unhurried manner he adopted when he wanted someone to feel like they had his full attention. He was 53 years old, heavy in the shoulders, with the kind of face that communicated trustworthiness before he spoke. Wide-set eyes, a jaw that suggested solidity, an expression of default good humor. He had always been, Rowan had often thought, extraordinarily good at looking like exactly what he wanted to appear to be. He saw Rowan come through the door and raised one finger, the signal for 1 minute, and finished the call with a smoothness that showed no awareness of anything unusual. "Rowan, didn't know you were in. Thought today was the audit," Rowan said. Damien took his feet off the table. "The one Gerald Fitch ran," Rowan continued. "The one you told me confirmed Elena's offshore accounts. The one where you personally delivered the source documentation to the auditing firm as my authorized representative." Damien was very still. "The documentation," Rowan said. "Where did it come from, Damien?" "I told you, I found it during a routine. Where did it come from?" The second time, the question was quieter. That was the version that meant something. Damien had been in enough rooms with Rowan to know the difference between the two. He took his reading glasses off his forehead and set them on the table and looked at them for a moment. "It's more complicated than you're thinking right now," he said. "Then explain it simply. The accounts are real. The activity is real. I didn't fabricate the existence of... Did you fabricate the connection to Elena?" Damien looked up. His expression had changed. Not dramatically. This was a man who had spent decades presenting faces, but in the small ways that Rowan was trained to read. Something behind the affability had shifted, settled into something harder and less apologetic. "What I did," Damien said carefully, "was make sure you saw information at a time when you were capable of acting on it. That's all. That's all. The marriage was a problem, not for personal reasons, for operational reasons. You didn't know who you were sleeping next to, Rowan. I knew that eventually it was going to stop. Rowan stepped closer to the table. I'm going to ask you one question, and I need you to understand that the answer you give me in the next 30 seconds will determine every decision I make after this moment. Not about you, about everything. Damien was watching him now with an attention that had nothing social in it. Who gave you the documentation? The silence lasted long enough that Rowan could hear the ventilation system, the distant hum of the city, the faint sound of someone's phone 2 offices down. Damien's jaw moved slightly, as if he was testing the shape of something before committing to it. People who understood the risk she represented, he said finally. People. A coalition. Parties with legitimate interests in a coalition of what? Damien looked at the table. Competing organizations, he said quietly. Organizations that have been trying to create a structural opening in the Draven hierarchy for a long time. Years. The marriage was... He paused, chose the next word with visible deliberation. It was a variable they could use. If it ended badly, if it created conflict, if it suggested she had lost her footing, Rowan's voice was completely flat. You handed me fabricated evidence to destroy my marriage so that rival syndicates could read it as a sign of weakness in Elena's position. Damien said nothing. And then the syndicates would move on her. Still nothing. And when they moved on her, Rowan said, the chaos would give them their opening against the Draven structure. Damien looked up. It wasn't, get out of my building. Rowan, right now, take nothing. Do not stop at your office. Walk to the elevator and get out of this building and understand that the next time I see you, we will not be having this conversation. Damien stood. He was a large man and he moved with the deliberate care of someone who was calculating whether the situation was recoverable. He picked up his glasses. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Rowan once more with an expression that had dropped all its architecture. None of the trustworthiness, none of the good humor, none of the reliable solidity. Just a measuring look, cold and sharp and entirely unfamiliar. You don't understand what you're walking into, Damien said. Walk, Rowan said. He left. Rowan stood in the empty conference room for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone and called Marcus. The shadow server logs? I have them, sir. Damien's credentials were active 11 days ago, and 6 weeks before that, and 4 months before that. The access pattern lines up with... Marcus stopped. It lines up with every major decision point in the Veil divorce process, every filing date, every audit delivery. Rowan closed his eyes for 2 seconds. Get me everything we have on any active threat assessments involving the Draven organization in the last 90 days. And Marcus, do it fast. He was back at his desk in 4 minutes. The threat assessment files were already loading when his encrypted line rang again. Not the mysterious number from this morning, but a channel he recognized, one that ran through a government-adjacent relay he used for sensitive client communication. The voice was a woman's. He didn't recognize it. Mr. Voss, you fired Damien Cross 40 minutes ago. His hand tightened on the phone. Who is this? Someone who's been watching your building since this morning. You should know that Mr. Cross did not go home. He went directly to a parking structure on Mercer Street and made a call that lasted 8 minutes. We intercepted the call. The content is... A brief pause. The content concerns you. He told them you know about the documentation. He told them you're already pulling Draven files. He told them you're a liability now. A liability to whom? The coalition he works for has 12 members. 3 of them have active operations running in this city at this moment. Those operations were planned around a specific assumption that Elena Draven had lost her family's protection by losing the marriage. That assumption is incorrect. The men who built the operations on that assumption don't know it's incorrect yet, but they will, and when they do, they will move quickly, and the most direct path to the pressure point they want is through you. Rowan was on his feet. Where's Elena? Boarding a private aircraft for a summit. The location is which summit? There's a meeting of senior Draven-affiliated operators once a year. Neutral ground, international waters, a luxury vessel. She's been attending this meeting for 6 years. She's attended it as your wife every year for 5 of those 6 years, and no one at your firm knew it because the travel documentation listed her as visiting a friend in Where is the vessel? The woman on the phone gave him coordinates. What's the threat level? He said. High, escalating. The coalition has assets positioned in 4 cities. We believe their primary objective is not to kill her. Then what? Capture. Alive. Use her as leverage against Cash and Draven to force a restructuring of the Draven network's senior hierarchy. His stomach dropped. When? He said. The operation is scheduled. We don't have a precise window, but our estimate is within the next 36 hours. Possibly less if they learn about your conversation with Damian Cross before we can... The line cut. Not dropped. Cut. Clean, deliberate, the way a line is terminated when the person on the other end has given you exactly what they intended and nothing more. Rowan stood in his office with the deadline in his hand and the files still loading on his screen and the city going about its afternoon 300 feet below him, and the full weight of the last 14 hours landed on him all at once. Not gradually, but in the particular way that reality lands when you've been holding it at arm's length and your grip finally fails. He had ended a 5-year marriage based on fabricated evidence. He had never once asked the woman across from him for the truth. He had handed his oldest professional ally 6 months of access to the most sensitive channels in his firm. And somewhere on the water, the woman he had called forgettable was walking into an ambush that his failure had helped create. He moved fast, called Marcus, told him to charter the fastest aircraft available, told him to pull every operational contact they had in the coastal network, told him to prepare a threat response package for a maritime extraction scenario and have it ready in 90 minutes. Marcus said, "Sir, we're talking about inserting ourselves into a Draven operation. If this goes wrong..." "It's already wrong," Rowan said. "We're just deciding what kind of wrong it's going to be." He was in the elevator before Marcus could respond. In the lobby, his phone buzzed. A text from a number that wasn't in his contacts. Clean digits, no country code. The same structural signature as the earlier call. "She refused 3 separate offers this morning to have your assets frozen and your firm dismantled. She said the marriage ended because respect disappeared, not because a document was signed. She said you were not her enemy. That may have already changed." Rowan read it twice in the lobby of his own building, surrounded by the ordinary movement of his own employees going about their day, and felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time and didn't have the vocabulary for yet, because he had spent years deliberately not maintaining that vocabulary. He pocketed the phone. He pushed through the front door into the cold afternoon air. The city moved around him. A bus, a delivery truck, 2 women arguing over a parking space, the smell of coffee from the cart on the corner. And none of it registered because he was already doing the calculation, the operational one and the other one underneath it, the one that didn't have clean variables and wouldn't resolve to a number. He had 36 hours. Possibly less. He had no jurisdiction, no authority, no invitation, and no reasonable expectation that the people he was about to approach would regard his presence as anything other than a complication. He had, as far as he could determine, exactly one thing in his favor. He knew what he'd done. He knew the specific shape and weight of it, and for the first time in 5 years, possibly longer, he wasn't looking away from it. He got into the waiting car. "Airport," he said. "Now!" The car pulled into traffic, and behind them, in the parking structure on Mercer Street, Damian Cross was making his second call of the afternoon, and the men on the other end of that call were already moving, and the window that Rowan didn't know was closing had just gotten significantly smaller. The aircraft Rowan chartered was a mid-range private jet, fast but not ostentatious, the kind of plane that a senior security executive could legitimately justify and therefore didn't require explanation. Marcus had it ready in 70 minutes. That left Rowan 20 minutes at the terminal, which he spent on the phone and didn't waste. The first call was to a maritime contact named Solace, a former naval intelligence officer who now ran private escort operations in international waters and owed Rowan a specific debt from a specific situation 3 years ago, in a port city that neither of them would ever describe in writing. Rowan gave him the coordinates and asked about vessel traffic in that corridor over the next 36 hours. Solace said, "That stretch of water is busy right now, busier than it should be for this time of year." Define busy. 3 vessels in a 12-mile radius that aren't running standard transponder signals. One of them is the size of a small cargo ship, but it's not carrying cargo. I can tell you that from the waterline. And there's been helicopter activity since this morning. Low altitude, no markings. Rowan said, "What about a luxury vessel, large class?" "The Meridian Sorrel. She's anchored about 4 miles from the main cluster. She's been there since yesterday. Private registry, no flag." "That's the one I need." Solus was quiet for a moment. Rowan, that cluster of vessels, the ones running without transponders. Whatever is anchored near that ship, it's not coincidental. I know. I have 2 fast boats I can put in that water in 5 hours, but I need to know what I'm putting them into. Rowan told him enough. Not everything, but enough that Solus understood the operational shape of it and could make an informed decision. Solus said he'd make the call and call back within the hour. The second call was harder. He had a number. He'd had it for 6 months, stored in the shadow system under a designation that he'd told himself was purely professional contingency planning. It was a contact channel for Draven-adjacent communication. He had acquired it during a contract negotiation 2 years ago with a private security firm that he later understood, with the benefit of hindsight that was doing significant work right now, was not entirely what it presented itself as. He had never used the channel. He had kept it the way you keep a fire extinguisher, present, unused, half believing the situation that would require it would never actually arrive. He dialed. It rang 4 times. Then a recording, a tone, a silence. He said, "My name is Rowan Voss. I have information about an active threat to a summit meeting currently underway on the Meridian Sorel. The threat is organized, it has coalition backing, and it is approximately 36 hours from execution, possibly less. I am traveling to the coordinates independently. I am not asking for permission. I am asking for someone to confirm that my arrival will not be treated as hostile." He ended the call. He boarded the plane. For the first 3 hours of the flight, nothing came back. Rowan sat in the forward cabin with his laptop open and the threat assessment files Marcus had compiled spread across the seat beside him, and he worked through them with the methodical focus that was the only thing he entirely trusted in himself. Not his instincts about people, clearly, not his ability to read the rooms that mattered, but the technical analysis, the pattern recognition, the identification of structural vulnerabilities in an operational plan. That he could still do. What he found in the files made the situation worse. The coalition Damien served wasn't a loose affiliation. It was organized with a sophistication that suggested years of preparation. Not a plan built around the divorce, but a plan that had been waiting for a suitable fracture point in Elena's public position and had identified the marriage as the most likely candidate years in advance. There were 12 member organizations across 8 countries. Their coordination used a communication infrastructure that had clearly been designed by someone with serious technical resources, encrypted, compartmentalized, routed through proxy networks that would take a government agency months to untangle. They had planned for multiple scenarios. If the divorce hadn't happened naturally, they would have manufactured a different fracture point. The divorce had simply saved them the effort. The capture operation targeting the summit had a name, an internal designation that appeared in the fragmentary communications Marcus had managed to pull before the trail went cold. They called it Clean Slate. The objective was not to harm Elena, but to take her off the board long enough to force Cassian Draven into a negotiated restructuring of the Draven network's territorial arrangements, using her as the leverage mechanism. The plan assumed Cassian would negotiate to preserve her safety. Rowan stared at that assumption for a long time. Then he thought about what he knew. The limited, imperfect, clearly insufficient amount that he knew about Cassian Draven, and about Elena, and about the way she had looked at him in the courthouse, those 3 precise seconds before she turned and walked out. He thought about the word forgettable and the fact that he had not corrected the man who said it. He closed the laptop. The response came 4 hours into the flight, not through the channel he'd called, but as a message delivered to the aircraft's communication system, which meant someone had known what aircraft he was on before he'd told anyone, and had access to its communication protocols, and had chosen this channel specifically to demonstrate that. The message was 6 words: "Do not approach the vessel directly." And then, 11 minutes later, a second message: "Dock at the eastern coordinates. Come alone." An attachment followed. Coordinates, different from the ones he had. Closer to the Meridian Sorel by about 2 miles, but on a different approach vector entirely. Rowan forwarded the coordinates to Solus with a note to hold position and not engage unless he heard otherwise. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling of the aircraft and thought about what come alone meant in the context of everything he had spent the last 12 hours learning about the organization that had sent it. It probably meant they had already decided he wasn't a threat worth eliminating. It probably meant Elena had communicated something, or someone adjacent to her had communicated something, that placed him in the category of complicated but manageable rather than hostile. It probably meant he was going to walk into a room with people who were vastly better resourced and informed than he was, and that the only thing he had to offer was honesty about what he'd found and what he'd done, and that honesty was going to be an extraordinarily uncomfortable thing to deliver. It also probably meant that whatever was waiting at those coordinates, it was not designed to make him feel good about himself. He was right. The dock was a private facility, barely a facility, more a reinforced concrete platform extending from a small island that didn't appear on civilian charts. Two men were waiting when his transport boat arrived, both in the tailored black suits he recognized from the courthouse. Neither spoke. One of them gestured toward a path that led inland, if 100 meters of scrub and rock could be called inland, toward a structure that looked like a converted storage facility and was clearly something else entirely. Inside, I'd passed 2 security checkpoints that were polite and efficient and absolute, was a room. The room had a table, 4 chairs, a window that looked out at nothing but gray water, and a man. Rowan had seen photographs of Cassian Draven. The intelligence files contained several, all low quality, all taken at distance. They had given him a general shape, older, controlled, the kind of physical presence that communicated authority without requiring size. The photographs had not communicated the specific quality of stillness the man possessed in person. He sat with both hands flat on the table and watched Rowan cross the room with the expression of a scientist observing something whose behavior he has already predicted and finds mildly interesting to have confirmed. He looked, Rowan thought, like a man who had stopped being surprised by anything a long time ago and had made a kind of peace with it. "Sit down," Cassian said. Rowan sat. "You chartered a plane," Cassian said. "You called a maritime contact. You used a channel you've held unused for 2 years. You arrived." He paused. "You're either very brave or very stupid, Mr. Voss. In my experience, those qualities are frequently indistinguishable. I have information about the operation targeting the summit. I have more information about it than you do. Then you know the execution window is tightening. I know that Damian Cross made 2 calls this afternoon, and that the second call authorized a change to the timeline." Cassian's hands didn't move. "The operation is no longer 36 hours out. It moved to 18 hours ago, approximately 4 hours ago, when Cross reported that you had left the city and were traveling toward the coordinates." Rowan felt the floor shift under him. "They accelerated because of me. They accelerated because you represent an unpredictable variable, and they prefer not to operate with unpredictable variables in the field. If you were moving, it meant something had changed. They didn't know what. They moved up the timeline as a precaution." Cassian looked at him steadily. "Your arrival may have given them approximately 8 hours of additional pressure they didn't need." The room was very quiet. "Is she—" Rowan stopped, recalibrated. "What's her current status?" "She's aboard the Meridian Sorrel. The summit is ongoing. She is aware of the threat. She has been aware since this morning." A pause. "She declined evacuation." "She—" Rowan looked at him. "Why?" For the first time, something shifted in Cassian's expression. Not warmth, exactly. More the particular quality of attention a person pays when something interests them more than they expected. "She said that running from the threat would validate the coalition's assumption that the divorce had weakened her position. She said the summit proceeds, the threat is managed, and the message to the coalition is that she cannot be moved." He paused. "She also said she had her own reasons for staying." Rowan didn't ask what the reasons were. He wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. "What do you need from me?" he said. Cassian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me about the coalition's documentation, the financial records, what you actually reviewed." Rowan told him. "Everything in order, precisely. The envelope, Gerald Fitch, the audit, the access logs, the structured absence in Elena's background records, the seam in the customs data." He presented it the way he would present a threat assessment, not editorially, not defensively, but as a factual sequence of information and decisions and their consequences. When he finished, Cassian was still watching him with that same measured attention. "You divorced her based on fabricated financial records that you never personally verified at the source," he said. "Yes." "You commissioned an independent audit through a firm whose access to source material was controlled by the man who had fabricated the records." "Yes." And you never asked her. The word her landed with the particular weight of a small thing that is in fact very large. No, Rowan said. I didn't. Cassian sat with that for a moment. Why? Because I had already decided, and I didn't want to be wrong. He said it without flinching, because the only remaining option was complete accuracy, and he understood that. I wanted a clean answer, and I took the one that was offered to me. The older man looked at him for a long time. The marriage, Cassian said finally, was a test. I want you to understand that clearly, not as a revelation, but as a fact that has been true for 5 years. I arranged it. I introduced the contact who introduced you. I chose you as the variable. The question I needed answered was whether a man of your specific profile, resourced, powerful, accustomed to control, could love someone without knowing what they were worth, without status, without leverage, without the architecture of power visible around her. He paused. I needed to know if you could see the person and not the position. Rowan said nothing. You failed early, Cassian said. But you failed in the ordinary way, through neglect, through prioritization, through the kind of emotional withdrawal that very capable men use to protect themselves from vulnerability. That was forgivable. Elena knew it was forgivable. She stayed. Another pause. The divorce itself I had not anticipated. The fabricated evidence I had not anticipated. I underestimated Damian Cross's timeline. For the first time, something moved in his voice. Not quite regret, but its functional equivalent. That is my error. She stayed through 5 years of a marriage that wasn't. Rowan stopped. That wasn't what she deserved, Cassian finished, without cruelty. Yes. She stayed because she had seen something in you worth waiting for. She is, among her many qualities, occasionally more patient than the situation warrants. Something in Rowan's chest was doing something he wasn't going to examine in this room, in this conversation, with this man watching him. He pushed it aside with the deliberate force of long practice and stayed on the operational problem because the operational problem was still running and was now 8 hours shorter than it had been. The approach vector for the capture operation, he said. What do you know about their assets in the water? Cassian tilted his head slightly. The first physical gesture he'd made, and it communicated something like approval in the way that a chess player might acknowledge an opponent's pivot. 3 vessels. The cargo ship is a command and coordination platform. 2 smaller fast craft for the extraction. They'll approach from the north, which is the blind side of the Meridian Sorrel's standard security positioning. He slid a paper across the table. Actual paper. Hand-drawn. The kind of document that didn't exist in any system. The summit vessel has countermeasures, but not at the level that would deter a coordinated assault. They're counting on deterrence through reputation. The coalition has decided reputation is no longer sufficient. Rowan studied the drawing. Your response assets. Positioned, but there is a problem. Tell me. One of my senior operators on the vessel, a man named Tarek, who has been with me for 11 years, sent a communication 2 hours ago that doesn't match his protocol. Cassian's voice didn't change. The communication used his correct authentication codes, but the phrasing contained an error that only I would recognize. A deliberate error. The kind a man uses when he is communicating under duress. Rowan looked up from the paper. Someone has turned Tarek, Cassian said, or is using his authentication under coercion, which means the coalition has a position inside the summit vessel, which means they know the internal security layout, which means every response plan I currently have is compromised. He paused. Which is why I agreed to see you tonight instead of simply managing this through my own channels. You need someone they're not expecting. I need someone whose presence on that vessel has no established meaning in their operational model. Someone not in their files, not in their contingency planning, not wearing a tailored black suit. He looked at Rowan steadily. Someone they will look at and see a divorced civilian CEO with no standing and no authority wandering into a situation he doesn't understand. And you think Elena will allow me on that vessel? For the second time, that almost shift in Cassian's expression. I think, he said carefully, that Elena's decision to stay on that vessel when offered extraction is connected, in some way, to the fact that she knew you had left the city and were moving. I have not asked her about that connection directly, because Elena does not respond well to having her reasoning interrogated. The faintest pause. She takes after no one I can identify. Rowan sat with that for a moment. Then something hit him. A cross-reference, a detail from the files he'd read on the plane, a number that hadn't matched another number and that he'd flagged and set aside meaning to return to. He returned to it now. The coalition, he said. 12 members, 8 countries. Correct. The financial structure of the operation. I saw fragments in the communication intercepts. Marcus pulled. The primary funding entity. He looked at Cassian. There's a holding company, 3 layers deep. The registered agent address is a building that was demolished in 2003. Cassian didn't move. That structure, Rowan said. I traced it for a different reason this morning, trying to find Elena's background records. It was the same chain. He stopped. Let it land. The same entity that holds the foundational financial structure of the coalition is connected to the same chain I found in the gap in Elena's background documents. The silence in the room changed quality. That shouldn't be possible, Rowan said. Unless the coalition isn't just targeting the Draven network. Unless someone inside that coalition has a direct historical connection to whatever was deliberately buried in Elena's past. Cassian's hands were still flat on the table, but the stillness around them was a different kind of stillness now. The kind that precedes movement rather than the kind that replaces it. Say the rest of it, Cassian said quietly. I don't know the rest of it. I found the seam. I don't know what's under it. Cassian looked at him for a long time. And then he said something that restructured every assumption Rowan had carried into this room, and several he hadn't known he was carrying. Elena's biological parents died when she was 4 years old, he said. The official record lists the cause as an accident, a vehicle failure on a mountain road in winter. He paused. The vehicle failure was engineered. I know this because I spent 7 years trying to prove it and was unable to find a surviving connection to whoever ordered it. He looked directly at Rowan. Until this moment, the oldest traceable link I had was a demolished building, a forged signature on a demolition permit, and a registered agent whose address didn't exist. The room went completely still. The holding company and the coalition's funding structure, Rowan said, is the same entity that paid for the accident, Cassian said. And then, before either of them could draw the next breath of implication from that, the facility's alarm system activated, not loudly, but in the precise, clipped pattern that meant the perimeter had been breached and the breach was not accidental. One of the men from this checkpoint appeared in the doorway. We have contact on the south approach. 3 vehicles. They're not ours. Cassian stood. The movement was unhurried and entirely final. He looked at Rowan. The coalition knows you're here, he said, which means Damian Cross had this location, which means he had it before tonight. He reached inside his jacket and placed a phone on the table, encrypted, preloaded, the kind of device that existed so far outside commercial infrastructure that it had no analog in anything Rowan had used before. Elena needs to know about the holding company before the summit session closes. She needs to know the name of the entity, and she needs to know the connection. There is a number in that phone. 1 number. You will need to be on the water before you use it, because the connection is proximity dependent and the meridian Sorel is the relay point. He was already moving toward a door that Rowan hadn't noticed in the back wall. The men outside will get you to the dock. You have approximately 4 minutes before that approach is no longer manageable. He paused at the door without turning around. Mr. Voss. Yeah. She told the man who called her this morning, the one who offered to have your assets frozen, that you were not cruel. She said neglectful, certainly, cowardly, in several specific ways, but not cruel. He opened the door. I'm telling you this not to make you feel better, but because I want you to understand exactly the weight of what she extended to you when she did not have to extend anything at all. He walked through and the door closed and the alarm was still running its precise, clipped pattern, and somewhere on the south approach, 3 vehicles that belonged to people who wanted Rowan in a different kind of room were getting closer, and the phone sat on the table in front of him, and the water was 4 minutes away. And on a vessel 4 miles out, a woman who had signed her own name with perfect steadiness in a courthouse this morning was sitting in the middle of something that his failure had helped build, and his honesty might be the only thing left that could reach her before it closed around her completely. He picked up the phone. He ran. He made the dock in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Not because he was fast. He wasn't. Not in the way trained personnel are fast. Not with the economy of movement that comes from years of physical conditioning in operational environments. He made it because fear is a remarkable accelerant, and because the south approach was buying him time. He hadn't earned. Two of Cassian's men holding a perimeter at the facility entrance with the particular focused efficiency of people who understood exactly how long they needed to hold it, and were not planning to hold it 1 second longer than that. The boat was a rigid inflatable, fast, low, the kind of craft that sits in the water like it's apologizing for existing, barely visible at 50 meters. The man running it didn't introduce himself and Rowan didn't ask. He was already on the phone to Solus before the engine turned over, shouting over the motor noise with his free hand pressed against his other ear. "I need you repositioned, north side of the Meridian Sorel, now." "That puts me inside their perimeter." "I know where it puts you. How long?" 40 minutes if I push it." "Push it." He killed the call and gripped the side rail as the boat came off the dock at a speed that was either impressive or reckless, depending on your relationship with water, and behind him the facility's exterior lights were still running. And somewhere on the south approach, there were raised voices and the sound of something being settled in the manner that Cassian Draven's people settled things. And then the darkness, and the water swallowed all of it. And there was only the engine and the spray and the black shape of the horizon ahead. The Meridian Sorrel was 4 miles out and lit from stem to stern, not ostentatiously, but completely, the way a vessel is lit when it wants to project confidence rather than concealment. At this distance, it looked almost peaceful. White light on dark water, the slow rock of something large and well anchored, the kind of image that belonged in a different kind of story entirely. Rowan looked at it and thought about Elena sitting inside it, aware of the threat, having declined extraction, and felt something move through him that was not strategic or analytical or any of the things he was trained to be. It was simpler and older than any of that, and it made his hands grip the rail harder than the boat's movement required. He pulled out Cassian's phone. One number, proximity dependent. He was still 1.5 miles out, possibly too far, possibly not. He dialed. It rang twice, 3 times. He counted the rings the way you count seconds when seconds are the unit of measurement that matters. She answered on the 4th ring. "You should not be in this water." Her voice was exactly as he remembered it, and not at all as he remembered it. The same measured quality, the same absence of performative emotion, but underneath it something that was running faster than the surface showed, and he recognized the combination because he had heard his own voice do the same thing in situations where he was holding himself together by the structural minimum. "I know about the holding company," he said, "the entity in the coalition's funding chain. It connects to the same structure Cassian traced to your parents." A silence. Long enough that the boat hit a wave wrong and he nearly lost the phone. "How?" Background record gap. "I found a seam this morning. I was tracing it for a different reason. Cassian confirmed the connection 20 minutes ago." Another silence. Different quality from the first. "The coalition isn't just targeting the network," she said. It wasn't a question. "Someone in that coalition has a direct stake in the original event. This isn't about territorial restructuring. That's the operational cover. The actual objective is me specifically." Her voice had gone very flat. "Not leverage. Not negotiation." "I think so." He heard her breathe. Once, controlled. The kind of breath that is not for oxygen, but for steadiness. "Tarek is compromised," she said. "Cassian knows. Tarek has access to the vessel's internal security grid. If they have his authentication, they can disable the countermeasures from inside before the exterior assault begins." A pause. "They would need to be within the vessel's local network range. Tarek would need to make the access from a terminal inside the ship." "Ship? Where is he now?" "I don't know. That's the problem." And then before he could respond, "How far out are you?" 1.5 miles. Maybe less. "There's a service access point on the vessel's port stern, below the main deck waterline. It's not on any registered schematic. Come in there." She paused. "Come in alone. If you bring anyone else aboard without my clearance, my people will not know you're not part of the assault." "Understood." A beat. "Rowan." She said his name the way you say a word you've been not saying for a specific length of time. "When you get aboard, find Tarek before they can use him. That's the only thing that matters when you get on this ship." The line went silent. He relayed the access point to the boat operator, who adjusted course without comment. The Meridian Sorrel grew in the darkness ahead, its light reflecting off the water in long broken lines. And somewhere in the middle distance to the north, Rowan could hear, or imagined he could hear, the engine signature of fast-moving craft that weren't running any lights at all. They were already moving. He went over the side into the water 40 meters from the hull because the boat couldn't go closer without making noise, and the water hit him like a physical argument, cold, immediate, the kind of cold that compresses your chest and makes your body's first instinct to gasp, and your brain's first instinct to override the gasp, and he overrode it and swam. The port stern. Below the main deck. He found the access point by feel more than sight. A recessed hatch set flush with the hull that opened when he pressed the correct sequence. Elena had given him the sequence in the last seconds before the call ended. 3 numbers. Simple. The kind of thing you can hold in your head while swimming in cold salt water in the dark. The hatch opened. He pulled himself through into a service corridor that smelled of marine fuel and recycled air and the particular enclosed smell of a large vessel's mechanical spaces. He was dripping and his hands were numb, and he stood in the corridor for 10 seconds, doing nothing but breathing and letting his cardiovascular system recalibrate from the swim, because the next part required him to be functional, and he was going to give himself exactly 10 seconds to become functional and not one more. Then he moved. The corridor ran forward along the port side, interrupted by 2 watertight doors that were dogged open, which told him either Tarek or someone working with Tarek had already been through here preparing access. He noted that and kept moving. The schematic Elena had described in 30 seconds on the phone was skeletal at best. She had given him the logic of the vessel's layout, not the details, and he was filling in the details as he went, using the sounds above him to locate the populated decks and the silence below to track where the mechanical spaces ended and the crew quarters began. He found Tarek on the 2nd level. He almost walked past him. The man was in a supply room barely larger than a closet, seated on a crate with his hands zip-tied behind him and a strip of tape across his mouth and a bruise across his left cheekbone that had the color and spread of something that had happened in the last 2 hours. He was conscious. His eyes found Rowan and did the rapid calculation of someone trying to determine whether the dripping stranger in the doorway was an additional problem or a solution. Rowan held up one hand, put a finger to his lips. Tarek nodded. He got the tape off first, fast, which was unkind but necessary, and Tarek pulled a breath that was more shudder than inhale and said very quietly, "There are 2 of them. They took my access credentials 4 hours ago. Coercion." He swallowed. "I gave them a modified version." Rowan stopped cutting the zip tie. Modified. "The authentication I gave them will appear to work until they try to execute the countermeasure disable. At that point, it will trigger a lockdown instead of a release." He looked at Rowan steadily. "I've been in this room for 4 hours trying to decide if I'd given them enough modification that they couldn't figure out what I'd done before they tried to use it." "Where are they now?" "They were heading for the secondary network terminal, Deck 3, midship. That's where they'd need to be to execute." Rowan cut the last of the zip tie and pulled Tarek to his feet and said, "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Can you fight?" A pause. "Probably not well." "Then stay behind me and navigate." They moved. Deck 3 midship was 3 levels up and 60 meters forward, and they covered it in just under 4 minutes, which was not fast but was quiet, which was the relevant metric. Twice Tarek put a hand on Rowan's arm to redirect him around a crew position, one of Elena's people, apparently, because Tarek knew their locations and was steering clear of them rather than toward them. Rowan understood. If they reached this quietly, with no alarm raised, the men who had Tarek's credentials would still believe their timeline was intact. The secondary network terminal was in a room that was half server infrastructure and half operational command, monitors, relay equipment, the kind of dense technical environment that required concentration to operate. The door was partly open, light from inside, the sound of typing, fast, practiced, the focused rhythm of someone working against a clock they believed they controlled. 2 men. Rowan assessed in the 3 seconds he had before moving, both seated, both focused on the screens, one of them with a sidearm visible on the console beside the keyboard, and the other with his jacket open in a way that suggested a holstered weapon at the hip. Neither was looking at the door because they had no reason to expect anyone at the door. He went through fast and low. The first man, the one with the weapon on the console, was a problem Rowan solved with his elbow and the corner of the monitor housing, in that order, and the man went sideways off his chair and did not immediately get up. The second man came up out of his seat faster than Rowan expected and got a hand on his jacket, and they went into the server rack together with an impact that sent something in Rowan's left shoulder into a place it had no business being, and he registered the pain the way you register pain when adrenaline is doing most of the decision-making, distantly, as a fact about the future rather than the present. They were on the floor. The second man was larger and had better leverage and was applying it. Rowan's left arm was not cooperating. He had approximately 4 seconds before the positional disadvantage became decisive. Tarek hit the second man across the back of the head with a piece of server housing he had pulled free from the rack, and the man's grip went loose and Rowan rolled clear and lay on the floor of the server room for 2 seconds, staring at the ceiling and listening to his own heartbeat, which was doing something emphatic and irregular. "You said you couldn't fight," Rowan said. "I said probably not well," Tarek said. "I was accurate." Rowan got up. His shoulder was a specific kind of wrong that he was going to deal with later, or not at all, depending on how the next few hours resolved. He looked at the screens. The authentication sequence was still mid-process. Tarek's modified credentials had been entered, but the execution command hadn't been sent yet. "Can you cancel it?" he said. Tarek was already at the keyboard. "Already done," he said. "And I've pushed the lockdown protocol manually. The exterior countermeasures are at full activation." He looked at the secondary screen. "They're going to know in about 90 seconds that something changed. Then we need to move." The assault came 4 minutes later. Rowan knew it was coming because the vessel's motion changed. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. The kind of shift that happens when something significant makes contact with the hull below the waterline. And then the sound system that ran through the ship's internal communication crackled once and went to a tone that clearly meant something specific to everyone aboard who'd been briefed. Above him, through the ceiling, he could hear running. Elena's people. He followed Tarek up 2 decks and through a fire door and onto a passage that ran toward the main salon, and the sounds ahead of him were wrong in a way he could categorize immediately. Not the sound of a ship's crew moving to defensive positions, but the sound of a confrontation that had already started in a space that was too enclosed for the number of people in it. He went through the salon doors, and the scene resolved in pieces. 8 of Elena's people. 6 men who had come in through an access point that was emphatically not the one he'd used, which meant either there was a second interior access point no one had flagged, or the assault team had spent considerably more time on the vessel's schematics than anyone had anticipated. Both sides were in contact, and it was the specific chaotic geometry of close-quarters engagement in a space full of furniture and glass and things that break loudly when people hit them. And Elena. She was on the far side of the salon, standing rather than moving, which was the detail that landed first and wrong, not because she was afraid, but because she was waiting, which was a different thing, and he tracked her eye line to understand what she was waiting for, and found Damien Cross. Damien Cross was on the Meridian Sorel. He was standing 12 feet from Elena, with a weapon that was not pointed at her, but was present in a way that communicated it could be, and he was talking, not shouting, talking, in the measured conversational tone he deployed when he wanted to appear to be the most rational person in a room. "Not what you're being told it is," Damien was saying. "The Coalition isn't your enemy. It never was. The restructuring proposal is genuine, and Cassian would see that if—" "Damien," Elena's voice, still. "Elena, stop talking." He did, briefly. "You came here yourself," she said. "That tells me the operational command structure is thinner than your Coalition advertised, because you wouldn't be standing on this vessel personally if you had sufficient people you trusted to manage the outcome." She tilted her head slightly. "Or you came because you wanted to be present for something specific, something you feel a personal stake in." Damien's grip shifted on the weapon, barely, but Rowan, who had entered the salon through the side passage and was now 18 feet away and moving laterally along the wall, caught it. "The holding company," Rowan said. Damien turned. The expression that crossed his face in the moment he registered Rowan's presence in this room was the most honest thing Rowan had ever seen him produce. Not the trustworthy solidity, not the reliable good humor, but something raw and sudden and almost afraid before it compressed back into control. "You're not supposed to be here," Damien said. "I keep hearing that today." Rowan kept moving, not toward him, diagonal, keeping the geometry complicated. "The holding company in your Coalition's funding structure. The one that traces back through the demolished building and the forged signature. I want you to tell me whose it is. This isn't, whose is it, Damien? You don't understand what you're... Rowan. Elena's voice, different now, a sharp, sudden edge under it. His left hand. He looked. Damien's left hand had moved to his jacket pocket while his right held the weapon, and the motion was the particular motion of a man reaching for something that was not a secondary weapon, but was a trigger, a remote, a device, something with a purpose that Rowan's operational training placed immediately in the category of, do not allow him to complete that motion. He crossed the 12 feet between them in a way that his shoulder was going to present him with a significant invoice for later, and hit Damien's left arm before the hand cleared the pocket, and they both went into a low table that shattered under the combined weight and momentum, and the weapon went somewhere that wasn't in anyone's hand anymore. They were on the floor. Damien was larger than he looked, and angry in the specific way of a man whose plan has been progressively dismantled over the course of a day, and who is now operating from something personal rather than strategic. He got a forearm across Rowan's throat and leaned, and Rowan's vision did the thing it does when you have insufficient blood moving through the correct vessels. And in that compressed and darkening space, he got his right hand into Damien's jacket pocket and pulled. A phone. Not a trigger. A phone with a single application open. A communication window. A message drafted but unsent. An address that Rowan read in the 2 seconds before Damien knocked the phone away. An address he recognized, his own firm's server address. The Shadow System. The one that contained every sensitive operation, every protected client, every piece of information that if released would dismantle Voss Security International at the Foundation. Damien had a dead man's switch. If the Coalition's operation failed and he couldn't send the abort code within a specific window, the message would send automatically. Not to a news organization, not to a government, to the specific entities that would do the most precise damage, rival firms, regulatory bodies, and 3 clients whose relationship with Voss Security depended absolutely on confidentiality. The forearm came off his throat because Elena pulled Damien back by his collar with the calm physicality of someone who has been trained for exactly this and has no feelings about using the training, and Damien landed on his side and stayed there, breathing hard, looking at the ceiling. Rowan sat up. His shoulder was the declaration of war. He breathed through it. The dead man sequence, Elena said, looking at Damien. What's the abort window? Damien looked at her. His expression had completed its journey from control to something that had no performance left in it at all. 40 minutes, he said, from the moment the assault was supposed to execute. A pause. 31 minutes ago. 9 minutes. The abort code, Elena said. Damien said nothing. Damien. Her voice was not raised. I can make the next 9 minutes very long, or I can make them very short. The choice is genuinely yours. He looked at her, at Rowan, back at her. And in his face was the arithmetic of a man who has spent decades calculating odds and has arrived at a number he does not like. The holding company, Rowan said from the floor. Tell me whose it is, and I will personally ensure the abort code is the last thing you need to give anyone in exchange for anything. Damien laughed, not with humor. It was the sound of something coming apart. You want to know whose it is, he said. You want to know whose money built that shell and paid for those forged permits and engineered a vehicle failure on a mountain road 37 years ago. He looked at Rowan with an expression that was the final honest thing he would ever show in a room with these 2 people. It's your family's money, Rowan. Your grandfather's structure. Your father inherited the maintenance of it. You inherited the proceeds. He paused. You've been living on the interest from a murder for your entire adult life, and you never knew because they made sure you wouldn't. The salon was quiet. Rowan's shoulder hurt. The floor was cold through his wet clothes. The broken table was somewhere behind him. Elena was standing 3 feet away, and he could not look at her and could not look away from Damien, and the room held all of that simultaneously in the specific terrible stillness of a moment that is changing everything and knows it. 8 minutes. The code, Elena said. Damien gave it. She relayed it to someone through an earpiece Rowan hadn't noticed she was wearing, and whoever received it confirmed the abort within 40 seconds, and somewhere in the server infrastructure of Voss Security International. A message that would have destroyed everything, dissolved unsent into the system that had been built to hold secrets, and had, for decades, held the wrong ones. Damien sat on the floor of the salon of the Meridian Sorel and did not try to get up. Outside, Rowan could hear the assault collapsing, Solus's boats from the north, Elena's people closing the exterior perimeter, the coalition's fast craft disengaging with the efficiency of an operation that has lost its command coherence and defaulted to retreat. The Meridian Sorel rocked gently in the aftermath of water traffic and held its position, and its light continued to project steadily across the dark water, because that was what it was designed to do. Elena walked to where Rowan was still sitting on the floor. She looked down at him. He looked up at her. There was a significant amount between them in that geometry. Everything that had accumulated over 5 years and 1 day and 17 hours, every silence and every misdirection and every moment he had looked away from something he should have held. And none of it resolved in this look, because resolution was not what this was. It was acknowledgement. The specific acknowledgement of two people who have stopped pretending there is nothing to account for. She reached into her jacket and produced a sidearm. Compact, clean, the kind of weapon that is carried by someone who knows exactly when to carry one. She held it out to him, grip first. He took it without speaking. "Damien Cross," she said, "is going to tell you everything about your family's history with that holding company, every connection, every transaction, every name. And then he is going to tell my people the full coalition structure, every member, every asset, every operational detail." She paused. "He is going to do this because the alternative, which I am prepared to implement, is considerably less comfortable." She looked at Damien. "And when he's finished," she said, "you're going to decide what you want to do with what you know." She looked back at Rowan. "Not what I want, not what Cassian wants. What you want to do." Her voice was quiet and entirely without softness, and more present than anything she had directed at him in 5 years of the same address. "Because that decision belongs to you, and I am done making it for you by default." She turned and walked toward the salon's forward exit, issuing quiet directions into her earpiece as she went, and the room filled with purposeful movement around the stillness of Rowan, sitting on the floor with a loaded weapon in his hand and the weight of a truth that had no clean resolution pressing on him from all sides. Damien looked at him from across the broken table. "So," Damien said with the exhausted pragmatism of a man entirely out of cards, "what happens now?" Rowan looked at the weapon, looked at Damien. Outside, the water was settling and the lights of the Meridian Sorel held steady against the dark. And somewhere forward on the vessel, Elena Draven was managing the aftermath of a war that had just shifted from violent to something more precise and more permanent. And Rowan Voss sat in the wreckage of an evening that had started on an airplane and was going to end in a way he could not yet fully see, but was beginning for the first time to choose. Damien talked for 4 hours. Not continuously. There were pauses, long ones, the kind that happen when a man is deciding how much of a thing he is willing to confirm out loud versus how much he can allow to remain in the comfortable ambiguity of the unspoken. But Elena's people were patient and systematic in the way that people are patient and systematic when they have done this before and understand that the pauses are part of the process and not an obstacle to it. And by the time the sky outside the Meridian Sorel's windows had moved from black to the particular deep blue that precedes dawn, Damien Cross had given them everything. Rowan sat in a chair against the wall of the room where the debrief took place and listened to all of it. He did not hold the weapon. He had set it on a side table when Elena's people arrived to manage Damien, and it had stayed there, and at some point someone had quietly removed it, and he had not tracked when. His shoulder had been examined by the vessel's medical staff and was not dislocated. A significant muscle tear, they said, and something strained in the joint capsule that would require weeks of specific treatment and would hurt consistently until it didn't. They had immobilized it and given him something for the pain that he'd taken because the alternative was not being functional, and he sat in the chair with his arm bound against his chest and listened to the history of his own family being dismantled aloud. The holding company was called, at its foundation, Voss Keller Holdings. Established 71 years ago by his grandfather, Aldrich Voss, in partnership with a man named Werner Keller, whose name appeared in no family document Rowan had ever encountered. Werner Keller had been, in the language of the period and the industry, an intermediary, a man who connected certain categories of people with certain categories of resources and took a percentage of the arrangements that followed. The arrangements he had been most valuable at facilitating involved the suppression of competitive interests. not legally, not through market mechanisms. Elena's biological father had been a man named Gregor Vanek. He had built, in the decade following a period of significant European instability, a financial network that competed directly with the interests of a consortium that included Aldrich Voss and Werner Keller. Not in the underworld. Gregor Vanek was not a criminal in any meaningful sense of the word. He was a banker. A very good one, with connections that were threatening to redirect significant capital flows away from the consortium's preferred channels. The consortium had communicated its concerns through intermediaries. Gregor Vanek had declined to redirect his interests. The vehicle failure had been arranged through Werner Keller's operational connections. Both Gregor Vanek and his wife had died on that mountain road. Their daughter, 4 years old, unremarkable in every way that mattered to the people who had ordered the arrangement, had been placed with relatives and subsequently, through a chain of circumstances that Damien described in the vague language of someone who knew the shape but not the specific details, had come to Cassian Draven's attention and then to his care. Aldrich Voss had died 12 years later. His son, Rowan's father, had inherited the holding structure and its proceeds and had maintained the shell for reasons that Damien described as purely precautionary. The structure held dormant liability, and dismantling it risked drawing attention to the original arrangement. So it sat, generating nothing, concealing nothing actively, simply existing as the kind of buried thing that families with complicated histories allow to sit, because the cost of digging it up feels greater than the cost of leaving it in the ground. Rowan's father had died when Rowan was 22. He had left no documentation about Voss Keller Holdings. He had left no instructions. He had simply left, the way people who carry something for a long time leave, with relief Rowan had always privately suspected, and now suspected with different specificity. The fortune that had seeded Voss Security International came from a legitimate inheritance, substantially. But substantially was not entirely. And the percentage that was not legitimate had never been small enough to ignore, if you knew where to look. Werner Keller's grandson had known where to look. He was one of the 12 coalition members. He was the one who had approached Damien Cross 4 years ago with the original proposal, knowing that Damien had access to Rowan, and through Rowan to the specific pressure point, a marriage, a woman, a position within the Draven network, that could be leveraged into the opening the coalition needed. The coalition had believed that Cassian Draven's greatest vulnerability was Elena. They had been wrong about what kind of vulnerability she represented. When Damien finished, the room was quiet for a long time. Elena stood near the window with her back partially to the room, looking out at the water. The sky had moved to gray, the kind of gray that is not darkness but is not yet light, the threshold color, the color of things that have not yet decided what they are. Rowan stood up from the chair. His shoulder made itself known. He acknowledged it and moved anyway, the way you move when the body's complaints are real but not the relevant consideration. He walked to where Elena was standing. She didn't turn. "The Keller grandson," he said. "He's in the coalition." "He was." She paused. "He is currently being located. He will be found. This is not something I am uncertain about." The other 11 members. 11 members. The coalition's operational capacity ended when the assault failed and Damien began talking. Organizations built on coordinated fear do not survive the defection of their most informed participant. The members will scatter. Some of them will attempt to rebuild something. They will not have the opportunity. A pause. Cassian is managing the residual. Rowan looked at the side of her face. The gray light made everything precise and a little unforgiving, which felt appropriate. "I need to tell you something," he said. "You've told me several things tonight. This is different." He waited until she turned, which she did after a moment, with the particular quality of attention she gave things she had already partially anticipated. "I didn't ask you. In 5 years I never asked you a direct question about who you were, where you went, what you were doing. I told myself it was respect for privacy, that I was giving you space." He stopped, restarted. That was not what it was. She looked at him without expression that he could clearly read, which had been the condition of their entire marriage and which he now understood differently than he had then. It was not blankness. It was the face of someone who had learned to stop offering things to people who didn't reach for them. "I was afraid," he said. "Not of you. Of what it would mean if I asked, and the answer was complicated. If the answer made you a person I'd have to actually know, rather than a variable I could manage at a comfortable distance." He held her gaze. "I was a coward in a way that looked like competence. I was very good at that." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "You were." No mitigation, no but. He took it. "The fortune," he said. "What comes from Voss Keller Holdings. Every asset, every company, every piece of infrastructure I built from that capital. I'm going to document the source chain and transfer everything it generated into a structured fund. Gregor Vanek's financial network. Whatever survived, whoever it passed to. Research institutions. Some kind of accountability mechanism." He paused. "I don't know the exact shape yet. I'll find people who do." Elena looked at him carefully. "That's a significant amount of money," she said. "Yes." "You'd have nothing left from the original inheritance." "I'd have the firm. What I built after. The legitimate after." He paused. "Maybe. The firm has its own complications. I know. I'll deal with them." He said it without bravado, which was the only way it could be said honestly. One at a time. She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was not warm and was not cold and was something more difficult than either. The expression of someone doing very careful arithmetic about a person they have significant reason to distrust and are not willing to stop seeing clearly. "I refuse 3 offers," she said, "to have your assets seized and your firm dismantled. People made those offers in good faith and with legitimate grounds. I said no. I know. I said no because the marriage ending was not your crime. Your neglect was your crime. Your cowardice was your crime. But someone else engineered the ending, and I don't hold people accountable for the crimes that were committed against them while they were busy committing different, smaller ones." She paused. "That is a distinction I believe in. It is not forgiveness." "I understand the difference." "Do you?" "Yes." She held his gaze for another long moment. Then something shifted in her face. Not softening, not warmth, but the particular shift of a person who has been holding themselves at a specific measured distance and has made a decision about whether to maintain it. "Go home," she said. "Fix your shoulder. Begin the documentation. What you said you'd do. Do it or don't do it, but make the decision clean and make it yours." She turned back toward the window. "And stop apologizing. What's owed is an apology. What's owed is different behavior. Those are not the same thing." Rowan stood there for another moment. The gray water outside moved in its slow, indifferent rhythm. Below them, the debrief continued. Elsewhere on the vessel, people were managing the aftermath of a night that had rearranged several structures simultaneously. "Elena," he said. She waited. "The cafe," he said. "The one on Clement Street. Where we had the first—" He stopped, because this was the kind of sentence that could become the wrong kind of sentence very quickly, and he wanted to get the distance right. "I'm not asking for anything. I'm not marking a date or making a proposal. I'm saying that if you ever wanted to sit across from someone who finally understands what he was looking at, that place is still there." She didn't respond immediately. He turned and walked back through the salon, past the broken table and the cleaned-up aftermath of a room that had held significant violence 6 hours ago and now held only furniture and light and the smell of salt air, and he didn't look back. He didn't know if she was still looking at the water or had turned to watch him go. He decided that not knowing was the correct condition for this moment and possibly for a long time after. The next 3 months were the most technically demanding of Rowan's professional life and the most personally exposing, and he did them in the particular order that the work required without regard for which order was more comfortable. The documentation came first. He hired a forensic accounting firm, not Gerald Fitch, someone new, someone who had no prior relationship with anything in his history, and gave them full access to every financial record going back to his grandfather's estate. He told them what they were looking for and why, and watched their expressions do the thing expressions do when a client volunteers the information that implicates himself rather than waiting to be found out. It took 6 weeks. The report that emerged was detailed and unsparing, and he read it in full twice before doing anything with it. The transfer was structured through a legal entity he built specifically for the purpose, advised by 3 attorneys and 2 financial architects, and a historian who specialized in post-war European financial networks, and who was, to Rowan's significant discomfort, genuinely fascinated by the Vanek case and its documentation. The fund was established in Gregor Vanek's name. Its mandate was the support of financial transparency initiatives and the education of children orphaned by political and economic violence, which was the closest accurate description of what Gregor Vanek's daughter had been that Rowan could construct without editorializing. He announced none of this publicly. He notified 3 regulatory bodies of the source chain documentation because the law required it and because he had decided that doing things because the law required them was not the same as doing them because they were right, and he was trying, with specific and effortful intention, to close the gap between those 2 categories in his own behavior. 2 of the regulatory bodies acknowledged receipt and opened administrative reviews. The third sent a representative to his office, who sat across from him for 2 hours and asked questions that were not comfortable, and to which Rowan gave answers that were not comfortable either. And at the end of the meeting, the representative said that the self-disclosure was noted and that it would be factored into any subsequent determination and left without further characterization. Voss Security International survived. Not intact, several contracts were suspended pending the regulatory reviews, and one major client terminated their relationship immediately and without detailed explanation, which Rowan accepted without contest. The firm was smaller after, structurally leaner. Several senior personnel departed, some because they had known things they hadn't disclosed and understood. The new operating environment would not accommodate that, and some because they simply didn't want to work for a company that was drawing the kind of attention that made comfortable people uncomfortable. He let them go. He rebuilt around the ones who stayed, which were the ones who had, in the various ways that professional loyalty expresses itself, always been the actual load-bearing structure. Marcus stayed. He was the first person Rowan told, before the regulatory filings, before the transfer documentation was finalized. Marcus listened to the full account without interruption, sitting in the office where he had delivered reports and intelligence assessments for 11 years. And when Rowan finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "What do you need from me?" "Not are you sure? Not this is going to be complicated. Just the practical question, which was the only one that mattered." Everything you always gave me, Rowan said, and I'll try to deserve it better. Marcus nodded and went back to work. Damien Cross was processed through a legal structure that Rowan did not control and did not attempt to control because it belonged to a different jurisdiction and a different category of accountability than anything he had standing to direct. He received updates through Marcus, who received them from sources he didn't fully explain, and the updates indicated that Damien was cooperating comprehensively with multiple investigative bodies across 4 countries, and that his cooperation was producing results at a speed that suggested he had a great deal to offer and had decided, in the pragmatic arithmetic of a man facing the arithmetic, to offer all of it. Werner Keller's grandson was found. Rowan did not receive the details of how he was found or what followed. He didn't ask. He understood that some categories of accountability operated outside the systems he had spent his career working within, and that the appropriate response to that understanding was not to pretend the systems were sufficient, but to be honest about what they covered and what they didn't. The coalition dissolved over the course of 6 weeks, not with a dramatic conclusion, but with the progressive quieting of something that had lost its structural coherence. Organizations built on coordinated interest collapse differently than organizations built on belief. They don't fracture along ideological lines, they simply stop, each component calculating independently that the return no longer justifies the exposure, and withdrawing to whatever cover remained available. Some of the 12 members were reached by Cassian Draven's people before they could complete that withdrawal. Others were reached by government bodies acting on the intelligence Damien's debrief had produced. A few simply disappeared from documented existence in ways that Rowan didn't look at too closely. Cassian Draven appeared in Rowan's office on a Tuesday morning in the 10th week without announcement. He arrived alone, which was either a statement of confidence or a statement about the nature of this particular visit, and he sat in the chair across from Rowan's desk with the same quality of settled stillness he had carried in that island room and said nothing for a moment, looking at the office with the mild curiosity of someone cataloging an environment. "You've changed some things," he said. "Some things needed changing. The regulatory filings are public record now, 2 of them." "Yes." Cassian looked at him. "The 3rd isn't public yet. The determination hasn't been issued." "No." "It will go against you," Cassian said. "It was not delivered as a threat or a prediction with particular weight, just information. The specific determination will likely require a financial penalty and a supervised operating period, not dissolution, but not comfortable." "I know." "You knew before you filed?" "Yes." Cassian nodded. A single small movement that conveyed something that wasn't quite approval but occupied the adjacent territory. "Elena has been in 7 countries in the last 10 weeks, he said. "The network restructuring is extensive. What she is building is different from what I built. Considerably different." He paused. "Better, in several ways I would not have anticipated. She has a quality of judgment about systems and their human costs that I am not certain I ever fully developed." Another pause. "I find that I am not sorry about this." Rowan said nothing. "I am retiring," Cassian said. "Formally. There will be an announcement through the appropriate channels. Elena will be named as my successor with full organizational standing." He looked at Rowan. "The announcement will be made from a position of demonstrated strength, not transition. The last 10 weeks have established that clearly enough that the announcement will not be read as opportunity." Because of what she did on the Meridian Soriel, Rowan said. Because of what she has always been, Cassian said. The Meridian Sorrel was simply the occasion on which the rest of the relevant world confirmed it. He stood. I came to tell you one thing, he said. Not to ask, not to negotiate, to tell you. He looked at Rowan steadily. She has not spoken of you to me. She does not discuss private matters, and never has. But I know her, and I have known her since she was 4 years old, and there are things that show in a person's functioning that they cannot entirely control regardless of their self-possession. He picked up the jacket he had laid across the chair arm. I am not telling you what to do with that information. I am simply being accurate. He walked to the door, stopped. Mr. Voss? Yes. My daughter has never needed rescuing. She did not need it on the Meridian Sorrel, and she will not need it at any subsequent point. He opened the door. But there is a difference between rescuing someone and choosing to stand in the same direction they are walking. That difference is worth understanding. He left. Rowan sat at his desk for a long time after that. The city moved outside his windows in its ordinary way. The bus, the construction noise to the north, the flat light of a morning that was not dramatic and did not require anything of anyone. His coffee was getting cold again. His shoulder, 3 weeks out of the immobilizer, ached in the particular way of something that was healing but not healed. The kind of ache that reminds you that the body accounts for everything eventually. He picked up his phone, set it down, picked it up again. He did not call. He had said what he had to say on the Meridian Sorrel, and he was not going to revise it or supplement it or undermine it with impatience. What he had said was a door left open, not a demand for entry, and the distinction was the entire point. He opened the regulatory response file and went back to work. The cafe on Clement Street was called the same thing it had always been called, which was nothing particularly evocative. A family name above the door, old lettering, the kind of establishment that had never needed to brand itself because it had been there long enough that the neighborhood knew what it was. It had a corner table near the window that caught the morning light in a specific slanted way that made the dust motes visible in the air and made the coffee steam look like something deliberate. Rowan went there on a Saturday morning, 3 months and 12 days after the courthouse, and he sat at that table, not the corner one, because the corner one was taken by a man reading a physical newspaper, and you don't displace someone reading a physical newspaper. He ordered coffee and a piece of whatever they had that was made that morning, and he sat with his repaired shoulder and his attenuated fortune and his considerably more complicated professional existence, and he read something on his phone that was work-related and didn't retain a word of it. He had been there for 40 minutes when she came through the door. No bodyguards. No tailored black suits at a perimeter. No operational formation. She was wearing a coat he hadn't seen before, dark blue, unbuttoned, and she looked exactly like herself in the way that some people manage to look entirely like themselves regardless of context, which was something he had noticed about her in the first weeks of knowing her, and then, through some mechanism of habituated proximity, had stopped noticing, and was now noticing again with the clarity of a thing seen fresh. She saw him at the same moment he saw her. Neither of them performed surprise. She walked to the table and pulled out the chair across from him and sat down with the economy of movement of someone who has considered arriving somewhere and has arrived. She looked at him. He looked at her. The cafe went about its Saturday morning around them. The clatter of cups, someone's child trying to negotiate a pastry, the hiss of the espresso machine, The man in the corner turning a page of his newspaper with the contentment of the unencumbered. The third regulatory determination came in, Rowan said. I know, she said. It's manageable. I know that too. A server arrived. She ordered coffee. Plain, no modification, the way she had always ordered it, which he remembered now, the small specific fact of it surfacing from wherever 5 years of ordinary mornings had deposited it. The Vanek Fund, she said when the server had gone. The mandate. You read it. Cassian mentioned it. The mandate will be reviewed annually and adjusted based on what the actual needs are. The initial structure is a starting point, not a permanent form. He paused. A lawyer who works in the education space reached out last week. She has some thoughts about how to make the student component more effective. I'm meeting her Thursday. Elena looked at him with the careful, undeceived attention that he understood now was not neutrality, but its opposite. The look of someone who is paying very close attention to whether the things a person says and the things a person does are moving in the same direction. You didn't build a monument, she said. You built something that requires ongoing work. Monuments are for people who want credit, he said. I'm not looking for credit. What are you looking for? He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. To be different than I was, he said, not dramatically, not in ways that make a good story, just structurally different, in the choices that don't have an audience. He paused. And I'd like to know you, the actual you, not the version I constructed in my head over 5 years because it was easier than asking. Her coffee arrived. She wrapped both hands around the cup. The cup was warm and the morning was cool, and the cafe's heating had not fully equalized yet. And she looked out the window at the street for a moment, where the Saturday morning was conducting itself with the ordinary indifference of Saturday mornings everywhere. I'm not the same person you married, she said. No. And you're not the man I married? No, I don't think I am. Then we're not reconciling, she said. You understand that, whatever this is, it's not a return to something. There's nothing to return to. I understand. She looked at him. The slanted morning light was in her eyes, and she didn't squint against it, just held it, the way she held most things, steadily, without flinching, with the particular quality of presence that he had spent 5 years sharing a home with and had somehow managed to walk past without seeing. I'm going to be in this city for the next 6 weeks, she said. The network restructuring has components here that need direct oversight. After that, I don't know. The work goes where it goes. I know, he said. 6 weeks is not a promise. It's a fact about scheduling. I understand the difference. She almost smiled. It was not quite a smile. The corner of her mouth moved and something in her eyes shifted, and it was the most genuinely unguarded thing he had seen on her face since a courthouse, and it lasted only a moment before the careful composure reassembled. But he saw it, and he held it the way you hold something you have learned to recognize as rare. Coffee, she said, is not a commitment. No, he said, it's coffee. She nodded, drank. He drank. Outside, the street moved. The Saturday light shifted slightly as a cloud crossed somewhere above, and then it returned, and the dust motes rearranged themselves in the air of the cafe, and the man in the corner turned another page, and the child successfully negotiated its pastry, and the espresso machine produced its reliable industry, and none of it required anything extraordinary from anyone at all. They sat for another hour. They talked about ordinary things at first. The cafe's coffee, which was better than it had any particular reason to be. The construction project 2 blocks north, that had been ongoing for a time neither of them could precisely identify. A book she had read on an aircraft 3 weeks ago that she described in the specific terms of someone who had read it carefully rather than quickly. He told her about the forensic accounting process, not with self-recrimination, but as a factual account of something that had been difficult and necessary and was now substantially complete. She asked 2 precise questions about the fund's legal structure that demonstrated she had thought about it in more detail than she was letting on. He answered them as completely as he could and noted the one area where the structure was still being refined. They did not discuss the Meridian Sorrel. They did not discuss the courthouse. They did not discuss Cassian, or Damien, or the Coalition, or anything that had the quality of the past asserting itself into the present with its full weight. Those things were not absent. They were in the room the way large objects are in a room, taking up space and altering the acoustics, but not requiring direct address. When she stood to leave, she buttoned her coat 1 button, then decided against the rest and left it open. She looked at him. "Thursday," she said. "There's a Portuguese place on the west side of the financial district. It's been there forever, and it's not impressive looking, and the food is better than it has any right to be given the decor." He waited. 7 o'clock, she said. "If you want." "I want," he said. She nodded once, turned, walked to the door and through it, and he watched her go. Not with the performance of a man watching someone important leave, but with the plain attention of a man who has learned at considerable cost that watching is not the same as seeing, and that seeing requires the willingness to not look away. The door closed. He sat with his empty cup and the light and the ordinary ambient sound of a cafe on a Saturday morning, and he did not feel resolved. Resolution was not what this was. Resolution was for things that ended, and this was the specific opposite of that. But he felt something that was honest and present and correctly weighted. The feeling of a man who has stopped carrying the wrong things and hasn't yet filled the space with anything to replace them, and is, for the first time in a long time, willing to find out what belongs there. He left a tip that was more generous than the bill required, not because anyone was watching, but because that was the kind of choice he was learning to make. He walked out into the morning. The city was just a city, noise and light, and people going about the business of their Saturday with the focused self-interest of people who have their own stories and are not aware of or particularly interested in anyone else's. He walked through it with his healing shoulder and his smaller fortune and his restructured firm and the specific, unspectacular weight of a person who has looked at himself clearly and found the accounting difficult and decided to do it anyway. 7 o'clock Thursday. He had 5 days. He intended to spend them working, which was what he did, and he did not manufacture urgency or drama in the interval because the interval didn't require any. What it required was exactly what it was. Ordinary time, moving at its ordinary pace toward a table in a restaurant he had not yet seen, across from a woman he was only now, after everything, beginning to actually know. That was enough. That was in fact more than enough. That was where something